There is a gaping hole where my elf used to be. I mean my heart. No, my elf. Hello there, everyone. This is Madhog, and as you might have noticed by my decisively more raucous voice that I am displaying here tonight, I'm sick. I am very, very ill at the moment. But I couldn't just do nothing with my time. I had a lot of time now that I'm ill, obviously, and I'm trying to fill it up with activities to do. And I suppose this is going to be one of those activities. This is some sort of journal or update or diary. And I guess also it counts as my last will and testament in case I don't make it out of this very hyperbolic sickness that I am experiencing at the moment. Funnily enough, I started feeling under the weather right after Christmas. In that sense, I guess I was lucky. It could have started before Christmas or during Christmas and infect literally everyone else in my family. But I guess I should count my blessings in that regard. Oh boy. This is going to be a very unedited, a very raw recording, because I don't have the physical or mental stability and strength to do some serious editing. Audio or otherwise, I just can't. So any flubs, any unexpected pops of the microphone, any of that, it's going to be left in, because I cannot be bothered to do a thorough editing of this audio. So what am I here to talk about? Well, I should, I guess, I could, should, could, would talk about some of the games I played. Yes, sure, why not? I've been trying to have a podcast with my friends to talk about games that we played, which was mostly going to be an excuse for me to vent about the last month worth of gaming experience in my life. But alas, there was never a good time to do that. There was never a huge availability in the usual days in which we would have availability. So here I am, essentially using this platform, my own platform, doing a solo podcast, if there even such a thing. There even is such a thing, I meant to say. Yes, grammar mistakes, that's all going to be left in as well. I simply can't, full stop. Yes, that's a sentence that I just said. Right, so, just as I began feeling oh so sick, I am on so many medications, you have no idea. I was playing Tales of Berseria. Now, if you've been following me on Twitter, you might be aware that I've tweeted extensively about the so-called Madhog's Christmas haul, which were 4 games that I bought taking advantage of a seasonal discount at the beginning of December. I played those games in the last 4 weeks, and I posted down my findings, thoughts, tribulations, and ponderings about said games. They were all mostly RPGs. I am on a huge JRPG kick as of late, for some reason. I don't know why, but I'm playing a lot of RPGs. I guess there is a familiarity to it, to this genre at this point. So since I mentioned the Tales of Berseria, I might as well start with that one. with talking about my experiences with that one so far. I am not even halfway through it, but I feel that after playing close to 20 hours, I have a more or less solid grasp of what does work and doesn't work about it so far. First of all, imagine being feverish while playing a Tales of game. Imagine having being haunted by fever dreams, Tales of related fever dreams. That's quite an experience, everyone, when your fever is reaching a certain point and you start feeling delirious and you're trying to sleep, and all your brain can conjure up in that seemingly demonic episode that you're having is an image, a haunting image of Lloyd Irving from Tales of Symphonia spinning around with his swords, eating random enemies, while his friends could not and will not stop yelling, "We must save the world, and fighting is wrong." Have I just ironically summarized every Tales of game that ever was? Let's not mince words here. If there is a series, a RPG, JRPG series that's overly reliant to its own tropes and themes and character archetypes, that is the Tales of series. And the only reason why it keeps getting away with that is because it is still one of the best written games of its genre. Which, unfortunately, is not saying that much, because it still features that moment, those specific moments in which characters would literally look at the player and say that fighting is bad and we must save the world. It's about as nuanced and subtle a theming as an hippopotamus with a brain disease, I suppose. Even the arguably the best game in the series, Tales of Symphonia, which to this very day is unmatched by any of the quote-unquote sequels, had those moments in which characters would just yell out loud what the themes of the story are. They would take the subtext, what should be the subtext, and just present it as text, and become essentially loud car horns for said themes. Onk onk, fighting is bad, onk onk. That should give you an idea. And, well, Tales of Berseria is, in that regard, just like any other Tales of game. In fact, to a degree that it's almost scandalous. I mean, stop me if you've heard about this premise before. So the world is controlled by a fascist theocracy. This is the point where you stop me, obviously. Whom have gained control over the hearts and minds of the people, exploiting their fears of demons and monsters. Incidentally, half of the playing party is made of demons. Never heard that particular circumstance before. And of course, you also have a race of beings that are literally magical slaves. And those beings are also the other half of said playable party. I keep saying, half jokingly and half seriously, that every Tales of game since Tales of Symphonia is a knockoff of Tales of Symphonia, mostly because they can never escape from the oppressing shadow of what that game was and what it accomplished from a narrative standpoint, from a character development standpoint, and Tales of Berseria feels pretty much right off the bat, or at least right after the first act, mind you. Yet another successor of the tried and true Tales of formula. And again, if the formula has been successful thus far, you would have no reason to change it, no reason at all, and such again is the case. At some point, we must come to terms with the idea that there will never be another game in this series that's better than Symphonia. I mean, I'm not saying anything new, right? There is a reason why they keep rehashing the same themes and the same circumstances, why there is an evil church that the good guys are fighting, while questioning authority and everything they thought they knew about the world, and why there is racism and the ever-present main themes of revenge and violence breeding more violence, and it becomes a vicious cycle, which was also the main theme of Tales of Symphonia, and there's also something about the environment here and there that's about as obvious and transparent as a kick to the head. Honestly, considering in about 20 years we are going to seeing a situation that's not too different from what happens in Tales of Symphonia, in terms of the world dying because of our actions, that's especially relevant. But again, when every game in the series does that, when every game in the series is about the environment, is about the church and fascism and violence and revenge, and a magical tree where all the mana comes from, because that's in every game I played, I swear to you. At some point, all of the accumulation of those tropes starts to wear on the soul, so to speak, and that's the case with me as well. So, is Tales of Berseria worth playing? I'd say yes, but only because they did something different. I mean, from a narrative standpoint and from a thematic standpoint, it's like every other Tales of game, and I am disappointed about that because the very beginning of it felt like such a unusually dark, twisted turn that promised a completely different tone throughout the entire enterprise. Such was not the case, because before you could notice it, it would just become another Tales of game. But here's when it differs. The characters. So you know that Tales of relies on the same 5-6 archetypes, right? You have the Lloyd Irving life main character, a complete do-gooding doofus with Pollyanna syndrome, optimistic to the point of idiocy. That's somehow the character by which everyone orbits around. That's how almost every male lead character in the series has been up until this point. Even before Tales of Symphonia, mind you, Lloyd Irving was the perfectioning of the archetype, if you will. Well, the main character in this game could not possibly be more the antithesis of a Lloyd Irving. She, as in Velvet, that's her name, is a... what's the best way to put it? She's an edge mistress, isn't she? She's a female edgelord, obsessed with revenge, bloody revenge, who was turned into a demon, or a very specific kind of demon that eats other demons, and... I know it sounds really silly, especially if you say it out loud, but I'd say that so far the game managed to do something interesting with her, in the way her relationship and dynamic with the other members of her party are is presented and all of those relationships are interwoven. In a way, it feels like every other Tales of game, because there are cute, funny moments that deepen said relationships and expand on the characters' personalities. Yes, that's what primarily works from those games, and that should never be changed. But it feels different because these characters, or at least some of these characters, don't really start out as good guys, as I already pointed out. They are motivated by a selfish thirst for revenge, and pretty much every character in their own way is dealing with some sort of grudge and revenge and retribution that they want to accomplish in varying levels of extreme, mind you. They all get accommunated. Is that a real word? Probably not. They all have something in common. They have a common ground. And that's how most parties in these kinds of stories get together. There is a interesting deviation from a well-known formula in that the last party member of your party is literally coerced into joining us after losing a duel to the death. So our circumstances are very peculiar, and in expanding on that, the entire party situation feels very peculiar, even though they are going through the same beats as any other party in this series has ever gone through. What are they going to do? They're going to fight the fascist theocracy? I mean, obviously, it's obvious what they're going to do. They're going to travel around the world, and I don't need to tell you how they're going to do it or what they're going to do it, but it will involve a lot of fighting. Even though fighting is wrong and violence breeds more violence. Doesn't that always feel a bit hypocritical in a game that's entirely built over the concept of killing in order to get experience points and becoming stronger? The only game, the only RPG where the message of violence is wrong that ever worked was Undertale, and only because Undertale was not really an RPG, it was a deconstruction, a postmodern deconstruction of the tropes of JRPGs, that in which you can actually go through the game without killing or hurting anyone. You cannot literally do that in a game like this. So the idea that violence is wrong and it breeds more violence and it becomes an eternal cycle that has no end, it's well and everything, but it doesn't really feel applicable in a game where you have to fight all the time, in a game where you have to kill all the time. I hate to say it, this is a classic example of ludonarrative dissonance. Boy, that is pretty much the most pretentious combination of words anyone could ever spout. But it gets the point across, right? You have a message, a main theme that you want to follow it on with your narrative, but the game that accompanies said narrative has you fight and kill everything that's before you. Which makes sense at first, as the main characters, as I said, are not exactly good guys, they are on a path of revenge, but at some point they will have to improve as characters. At some point they will realize, inevitably, that revenge is pointless, and violence only creates more violence. And what's going to happen after that? Well, no pacifist run, that's for sure. I seem to be a bit hung up on that, so let's move on. My experience with the game has been mostly positive. I don't know if amidst all the snarky comments so far I get that point across, but it was fun, for the most part. I feel that the game is bogged down by a few pointless gimmicks. I don't care much for enhancing or dismantling weapons, and I don't care much about passive abilities given by equipment, which is something that they took right off of Final Fantasy IX. And also, let's be honest here, as an action RPG, Tales of has been rather gimmicky since the beginning, because you are technically fighting in real time, but you cannot exactly do all the fighting you want, because there are a few clauses, if you will, that prevent you from going all out, as you might want to do. So it's like it's trying to be its own entity in that sense. It's trying to combine a more freestyle action RPG style with a traditional strategic RPG style, and I don't think that's really all that applicable in the grand scheme of things, but I will be lying if I said it didn't feel nice to get a multiple chain combos or combo chains out of unsuspecting foes. So yes, Tales of Berseria, it's fine, really. I'm having a good time with it. The last time I played a Tales of game, it's been quite a while actually. I think it was Xillia the last time. The last one I tried on, and I remembered being quite underwhelmed by it. I cannot help but feeling that once you play a game in this franchise, I went a bit Sean Connery in there. I cannot help but feeling that once you play one title in this franchise, you played pretty much them all. Which is a bit unfair of a statement, but let's face it, the only other long-running JRPG franchise that's more dependent on its own tropes and formulas is Dragon Quest. I cannot think of any other JRPG that's more dependent on its own established conventions. So, if you like, generally speaking, if you like this series, you will also like this one. I guess that's the best way I can put it. The characters are likable and compelling, even if they don't start up as good guys, but they slowly transition into a more ambiguous position as the plot evolves and goes on, and I still pretty much enjoy all of those optional cutscenes that, when they are not obnoxiously spouting what the subtext of the game is, when they are not obnoxiously telling you what the game is about, they are fun little situations in which the characters' dynamics and intercurring feelings for one another are expanded upon. And I will say something important here. The first time I played a game in this series, the first game that I tried was Tales of Graces F. Now, that game had a terrible, terrible narrative. I don't remember much about it right now, but it was such a dumpster fire nonsense. But, as it happened, the characters were likable enough to sustain my experience throughout it. And that's a very important lesson to take away from my own experience with this. And mind you, this counts for pretty much every medium, every narrative from any sort of place, whether it be a film or a TV show or other video games or comics. A narrative, even a mediocre one, can take a lot of leeway if the characters that the narrative focuses on are compelling and likable enough that you would want to spend time with them. That's a not very well known truth about storytelling, but the most important thing about your story are the characters that are moving the plot along. So even though the plot might end up being idiotic, if you enjoy what the characters are all about, if you enjoy who they are and what they do and everything about them, then you might feel inclined to forgive some of the missteps from the overall narrative. Now, I am not supposed to say this because I am a critic, former film critic. I worked in the industry and whatnot, and you are not supposed to say this because, you know, if a story is bad, it's bad. But again, is it really that bad of a story if the characters are well written and you want to be part of their world? Ask Xenoblade Chronicles 2 about that. The narrative was generic RPG fodder, but the characters were so likable that it pretty much kept me invested. Even though the villains were lame and everything else about it was subpar, it still had compelling protagonists and an interesting, fascinating world to explore. Tales of Berseria at least has likable characters in very likable situations with interesting arcs and plots that they are going through, conflicts and emotions and everything in between. Now, as far as the graphical fidelity goes, well, so this game originally cost 79 euros. 69 euros, actually, which is scandalously high price, even for a new game. I was able to get it with a huge discount for only 14 euros. But let me tell you, I don't know how long it must have taken to program this game, how expensive those 2D animation sequences were. They looked expensive. Well, some of them did. But Tales of Berseria is the kind of game in which it will present to you well-designed, well, for the most part, well-designed characters and stunning, beautiful environments. And then, once you put a magnifying lens on it, you will notice that the ground that these characters walk on, it looks like Nintendo 64 polygonal landmasses. It's not good in the slightest. They had to cut corners, obviously, at some point, but it's very inconsistent. The graphical fidelity is very inconsistent in this title, in the stylistic choices and whatnot. Also, I mentioned well-designed characters. Well, let me tell you something about that. The main character is not one of them. Velvet has one of the worst, most hideous, egregious outfits I have ever seen. Full stop, really. She's wearing this tattered, stripped, scanty, black and red getup that it's just so ugly to look at. I cannot believe somebody thought this was a good idea. I mean, it's a great idea if you want to fetishize your main character. We all know what the main audience for these games is. But still, there had to be a better designed way to do that, because it's a really ugly mess. Oh, it's so bad. The game gives you some alternative outfits, but you have to unlock them. And you have to unlock them all throughout the game, and for the most part you're left with just the worst. The worst that it can offer. And unfortunately, that tattered black and red edgelord strap-on, whatever it's supposed to be, that's the default outfit of your protagonist. Oh boy. That's too bad. It's a shame. The only other alternatives I have for that outfit would be her absolutely boring and plain villager outfit, which she wore at the beginning of the game. And also no outfit at all. Literally just a couple of stripped, tucked on tatters that are just thin enough to cover her nipples. That's what I'm working with here. So aesthetics that's what I just said. Aesthetic woes aside, I am enjoying it. Pretty much, very much. Now, Tales of Berseria was not one of the 4 games that I bought in the seasonal discount that I mentioned at the beginning of all this. No. Tales of Berseria was an additional gift I gave to myself after the 4th game from my official Christmas haul, which you can read all about on Twitter, by the way. I have collected all my thoughts in moments for easy peruse. You should check that out for a more thorough analysis, if you will, of what I thought of those games. But the last game in the original Christmas haul was a little title named Rogue Galaxy, which, well, it's a Star Wars ripoff, for starters. It's a RPG from 2005, not a good period for RPGs, in retrospect, developed by Level 5, and that's not the only game in this haul that's developed by Level 5, and I could not play more than 16 minutes of it before completely deleting it from my system. And the reason why I was so bitter towards it is because I come off playing another game from the same studios, Level 5 that is, which is titled Dark Chronicle, which is the second game from my Christmas haul, by the way. Dark freaking Chronicle, also known as Dark Cloud 2, I did not know it was a sequel, but there you go. It's a complete, unadulterated, headache-inducing mess. It's the video game equivalent of schizophrenia or of multiple personality disorder. It is bogged down by a million core gameplay mechanics that don't mesh well together, and the end result is jarring and a test of patience and strength of will, really. And from the looks of it, Rogue Galaxy was just another game like that, and I could not take any more of that. So Dark Chronicle, the best way to describe to you this unmitigated disaster that passes for a game It's partly a Zelda-esque action-adventure, but with dungeon crawling, whereas every dungeon is a different level. Almost like akin to an arcade. It has RPG elements, like your weapons leveling up, but also your weapons tend to wear down, so you have to repair them, which is annoying. And on top of all that, this game, to my shock and surprise, it's also a tycoon simulator. Yes, you're not drunk, you did not hit your head on the desk. That's literally what happens in this game. You have action-adventure with RPG elements, which are annoying in their own right, but you also have The Sims, or SimCity, or any tycoon simulator in which you literally are forced to build houses and villages and bring people to live in said houses and villages, and it's not a side mission, it's not a side quest, an optional side quest, it's a, like I said before, a core gameplay element. You cannot advance in the story if you don't complete a set of objectives having to do with tycooning the proverbial shite out of any given area you end up in. It's befuddling, bewildering, and just bemusing overall, and it's a miracle I managed to resist for 20 hours before giving up on it. It's a bizarre experiment that really feels like a product of its time. The early years of the PlayStation 2, where old established genres that worked well for the PlayStation 1 tried to be revamped for the new generation, but they did not quite know how to revamp them, so they ended up relying on a ton of infuriating gimmicks to do so. And speaking of which, let me talk about the bane of my existence, which is Wild Arms 3, the first game from my Christmas haul. I know I am addressing them in disparate orders, but there is a reason for that. I'm leaving the best for last, that is. Wild Arms 3 is possibly the most underwhelming JRPG I've ever played in my entire life. Yes, you heard me. I think it's worse than even the worst JRPG I've ever come across. It's more annoying than Final Fantasy VIII. It's less developed and less wholesome than Final Fantasy XIII. It's more boring than any given Dragon Quest game, even though you don't have to grind all that much. And, well, it has the worst puzzles ever. And that's pretty much my main gripe about this game, is that every single element, both big and small, are conspiring against me to dampen my supposed enjoyment of this game, because first of all, it's a complete waste of a perfectly good premise and setting. This is not your typical fantasy RPG or even your cyberpunk fantasy RPG. This is a proper sci-fi western, very similar to Trigun in that sense. And yet, the plot is the most generic RPG fodder that ever was, with the most forgettable, annoying villains that you fight a million times over and over again, and the least interesting and developed characters in existence, I am tempted to say, if you allow me to be hyperbolic about it. And every single element, every single little thing is absolutely detestable. So the game puts you on rails pretty much from the start. It gives you a very basic idea of what your characters are supposed to be. Characters so one-dimensional you can literally describe their entire deal and personality with one single word. So you have protagonist, moron, emo, and dead. These are your main characters, and there isn't really much worth learning about, as I found out in the worst possible way. They don't have a proper group dynamic, that's never really established. They are brought together because the plot demanded it. There is never, I feel, a reason for them to stick around, even though the game will tell you on occasion that they forged a bond that will last forever. I don't see it. They have no chemistry, and there is virtually no time dedicated to developing said chemistry, because, again, you are put on rails pretty much from the start. You are put on the rails of the main plot, which is rushing you through it as much as it can, because it thinks it's so interesting, but I have no reason to be invested in it, because I am not invested in the characters in the slightest. They are so dull. So spectacularly dull. So detestably boring. But that's just the peak of the iceberg here. Because, hey, guess what? There is a world to explore, and you have to find a place or the next place to go in, and this is just a dumb decision overall. So in any RPG that ever was, you would have to walk in the world map up until you find a village, right? Or a dungeon, or anything, right? Well, not in Wild Arms 3, oh no, I don't know how previous games in the series are, but I have to assume that's a staple of the franchise. It has to be. Because if you want to get to a town, or a dungeon, first of all, you have to get indication for it, which, again, it's normal, but guess what? You literally cannot find it if you're not made aware by one of the NPCs that it exists. Meaning that after you find out that it exists somewhere in the world, you have to go to the general direction that you were given to find it, and you have to click the square button on your controller constantly up until it magically appears before you. And that's the same for every single location in this godforsaken game. Can you imagine every single dungeon, every single town, every single place you need to get to progress in the story? You have to find it like this. Who thought this was a good idea? Seriously. And it gets much, much worse when the game properly opens up and you're supposed to explore the world. There is no point in you exploring the world unless you know where you need to go, and you know that it exists in the first place, otherwise you will find nothing! Nothing at all! And don't get me started on how infuriatingly unintuitive it is to navigate said world to begin with. I had to look up a walkthrough to understand exactly where the game wanted me to go, to find the place I was supposed to go to, multiple times. When you had to bring up a walkthrough to find out where you have to go next, literally, to progress the story, that's when you just have to distance yourself from the game and rethink your entire life choices. It's devastating, really. It's a conundrum how a game like this exists, really. And I have not even started on the puzzles, the bloody godforsaken, unintuitive, awfully ill-begotten, grossly designed, time-wasting puzzles that are in every single dungeon. Every single one of them in this entire adventure. They are riddled with obnoxious, time-consuming puzzles that only exist to artificially lengthen up your gameplay time, which means that if you removed all those puzzles entirely, 20 hours of gameplay will be 8 hours. I am not even exaggerating. This is time that could have been used to develop the characters, to develop the world, which is otherwise very barren and uninteresting, to develop a narrative worth getting invested, to give me a bloody reason to care about this world being in danger, because as it happens, I have no investment whatsoever and it can burn to hell and back. Seriously. It's that bad. I cannot even begin to describe how these puzzles work out. You have your menagerie of mayhem in terms of puzzles. It's an unwieldy, chaotic mess. You have your memory puzzles, your Resident Evil push the blocks puzzles, your memorize the light pattern and do it afterwards puzzles, your move object puzzles, your use object to move up to move other objects puzzles, your move the camera in such a way that you see the solution of the puzzle. Everything that you could possibly hate and detest, despise and love from games featuring puzzles of any kind. They are all concentrated in this one festival of fracas. I don't know where I was going with that, but yeah, Wild Arms 3 is just a disaster. It's bloody awful and bloody unwieldy, and I cannot for the life of me just explain to myself why I spent 20 hours on it, and those 20 hours felt like 40 or 50 hours. It feels like I played 2 games, at the very least, in those 20 hours. I was shocked to find out that I've only played 20 hours of it, because I could have sworn it was a lot longer. It felt a lot longer, and most of it was the damn puzzles and finding the stupid dungeons and towns in your map in the most unintuitive way possible. Oh god. Oh gosh. Oh. So after establishing that this game is terrible, and after my suspension of disbelief is thoroughly dashed away from the experience overall, that's when I started to notice even more details that bothered me in a compounding way, so to speak. They compounded on my soul, all of these details, and the enemies in this game are weird. Very, very weird. Not just in relation to their placement in the map, but also for what they are. So you have your upside-down desert cats, you have your black-face jellyfish monsters. I am not even joking. There is a possibility that the black-faced jellyfish monster is based off a Japanese cultural tradition, which, let's not mince words, different culture and everything, but those specific portrayals were also based on dicey elements. But regardless, I call it a black-faced jellyfish because this is a Western-themed game, which means that's a blackface, and there is no going around it. Oh, and of course, then you have possibly the most random, inexplicable boss in the game, and any other game for that matter. So at some point you have this little green goblin with a gigantic head that's attacking you using poisonous boogers. It makes no sense whatsoever. I mean, you're supposed to suspend your disbelief in this sense, but this was a boss enemy. In games such as this, boss enemies have a narrative reason to occupy the space that they do. Maybe it's a guardian monster of a temple that you have to defeat in order to beat the temple, or maybe it's one of the main villains who makes a surprise appearance. This guy, this green goblin, which is named Olivier, by the way, yes, it's a venomous booger man named Olivier. Just wrap your head around that concept, if you will. This little green man appears completely out of nowhere, with no explanation whatsoever, in a specific environment and context by which it had no reason being there, it had nothing to do directly with it, and you are now suddenly inexplicably fighting this stupid green man boss that attacks you with poisonous boogers and is named Olivier. I cannot make any of this up. But that's not even the weirdest enemy I find in this game. Oh, no. You see, now it gets really interesting. I mentioned before that this game takes a lot of inspiration from Trigun, which is kind of inevitable considering the influence that Trigun had at the time, and also, can you really think of any other popular major sci-fi western franchise outside of the short-lived Firefly or maybe Outlaw Star, depending on who you are? You probably can't at the moment, so Trigun is a big influence. It is such a big an influence that you are literally fighting it in the game! Yes, you heard me. You are fighting Trigun in the game. Not the abstract concept of Trigun, not a character from Trigun. You are literally fighting a low-resolution JPEG file, slightly altered JPEG file of a volume of the Trigun manga. You enter this base, this futuristic base, and you find yourself fighting a floating Trigun manga that attacks you. I don't care who you are or where you're coming from, you will never find a weirder and more bizarre enemy, video game enemy, than literally a volume of Trigun the manga attacking you. You can try to rack your brain finding anything weirder than that, but there is no such a thing as anything weirder than that. And you know that's true, so don't even try to deny it. Don't even try to pretend that I am wrong. I am right. There is nothing more bizarre and bewildering than this. Oh, jeez. Wild Arms 3 is a game that I cannot recommend to anyone. It's bad, but not in a funny way. It's just boring and soul-crushing. Whenever I get to a new dungeon, I dread the prospect, the inevitability, mind you, of running onto one of those damn time-consuming puzzles that do not make me feel smarter for beating them, they just make me want to bash my head on my television screen, because they are so pointless and they are such an artificial way to prolong the length of the game. And if your game needs to have such a blatant, transparent gimmick in order to be longer than it needs to be, then you don't have a good game in your hands. So that was Wild Arms 3. As I said before, I left the best for last, and the best in this case of my original 4 games worth of Christmas haul is Ys Origin. Now, Ys is a long-time action RPG franchise that I've only recently discovered, and I'm glad I did, because I think this is exactly my cup of tea. The game itself is a very straightforward, lean, focused experience, all keywords in this context, by the way. They are not bogged down by unnecessary gimmicks, they are not ruined by unnecessary core gameplay elements. It's just a straightforward, tower-climbing action RPG with very simple controls, very intuitive controls to pick up and play, but also very challenging to master. It is a challenging, arduous game, but one that actually I want to be challenged by. I relish the challenge because the game is solid, the run is fast and furious, the characters are likable and well written. It is overall a pleasant experience from start to end. This game is a prequel to the overall Ys series, to my understanding. That's probably why I chose to start with this one. From an aesthetic and stylistic standpoint, it seems to be a callback to the first few games in the series, which were from the PC Engine days, and Ross Ferris, my good buddy Ross Ferris, would know all about that, obviously. He is the master of overhyped consoles, after all. Maybe overhyped is not the right term, but you get the idea. He played those games, so we have something in common for a change. Usually we don't agree on which games we enjoy. For example, he likes the Persona series and enjoyed the Persona 5. I despise the Persona 5 for many reasons, too many to even bring up in this particular recording, also because I don't really want to. I'm reaching my limit, as it were, so I'll get right to the point. Ys Origin was such a pleasant, fun experience. You have 3 playable characters that you play the game with, not together as a party, but rather you choose a character and you play the story mode, and you beat the story mode with that character, then you go to play the game again with the other character, and there is a third character. Yes, that's a word, character. There is a third character that gets unlocked once you beat the game with those first 2. And there are pretty much the same enemies and bosses every time, with small differences, but the story changes ever so slightly, depending on which one of these characters you're playing as. And they all fight in very different ways. You have the short to mid-distance sword-wielding fighter, or warrior. You have your distance attacking mage, and also you have your extremely physical, fast attacking berserker, unlocked as a third option. And playing as the third character reveals the real true final boss of the game, which is not easy. But here's what I enjoy about this series, this game, I should say specifically, because I've yet to play any other game in the Ys series. YS, Ys, that's how it's written, by the way, YS. Like I said, it's very straightforward, very linear, but also very fun. It's very lean, simple to understand, difficult to master, which is fair. The bosses are pretty hard, but they are usually the kind of bosses that would relish a try and error sort of strategy, would be beatable once you actually learn what their patterns are and the best strategy in the context of said pattern. So even the final boss, which was very hard, became doable after I learned what his tricks were. And make no mistakes, they are pretty nasty cheap tricks, but that's not even the most difficult boss in the game. No, the most difficult boss in the game was that damn centipede monster, which I had so much difficulty dealing with all three characters. Of course, beating it becomes trivial if you actually spend time grinding for levels before fighting it. Which, it feels wrong because it goes against the spirit of the game. And yes, you can level up and grind for levels, and it's actually very easy to do and very fast too to accomplish. But I think half the fun is to be appropriately level and defeating said monsters using your cunning as well as your game skills with a Z. But you know what, the centipede is extremely cheap and I don't even want to deal with it anymore, so I just ground my way through victory. Well, I guess that's about it for my Christmas haul. If you want to read about my experience with it, if you want a more thorough investigation, shall we say, and analysis about what I went through with these games, like I said before, you should check out my Twitter, at Adriano Bordoni1. The link is in the description of the video, as it always is, and you can see the Christmas haul moments that I posted on Twitter for your convenience, so that you can see what I experienced with these games as I went through them. You can also see my many snarky comments about them, which is, I have to imagine, the most obvious selling point of tweeting about anything, really. Right, so like I said, I've reached my limit, and I don't know how much of a rambling mess this recording is at the end. Like I said, I'm not going to bother editing it because I simply don't have the strength and mental capacity to endure more complex editing than just place audio below video and then render. Right, which is exactly what's going to happen here. I guess I'll mostly use footage from my first hour or so of Wild Arms 3 for this, because why not? I cannot use footage from Tales of Berseria because Namco Bandai does not like you for you to share their footage on YouTube, from what I could see. Unless, of course, you're tweeting about the many trophies that you're winning at that game, because it means you're good at games, and whatnot. So, yes, if you can somehow make any sense whatsoever of whatever it is I just said in the past 1 hour and 4 minutes and 34 seconds and 38 seconds and 40 seconds. You get the idea. If you can somehow, if you had managed to stick around to listen to the entirety of this, and I cannot understand, I cannot fathom why you would want to do that, but I am deeply appreciative of that. So I guess that's it for my incoherent rambling about games while being sick. I think that might even be the title of this video. Because why not? Hey, if I can get PT points, I guess it's a win. Or something along those lines. I am barely coherent. I am barely with my wits about me. It's a good thing my fever is going down, but I still have so many medications to go through. Right. Thank you for joining me, everybody, in this solo podcast experience. Which, depending on how you view it, it's mostly like every other podcast I've ever been on, mostly me talking and drowning everyone else. Because I have so many things to say every time, and I want to make sure I say them in the most erudite way possible. So that's that. Good night, everybody.